All right, so let's cover the election. The election procedures are going to change based on two factors. The first factor is whether it's a two-party or a one-party election. If one party or the other ever gets to public support 9 or greater, they're said to be dominating the political landscape and will use a one-party election procedure. Otherwise, we'll use a two-party election procedure, and that'll be the most common. The other factor will be whether the 12th Amendment has passed as an issue or not. 12th Amendment linked presidential and vice presidential candidates together. So based on those two factors, we can have 4 different election procedures. Regardless of which election procedure we're using, the core process stays the same. First, we identify the nominees. The nominees announce their running mates. Each of the candidates, the presidential candidates and the VP candidates, will place cubes on the state maps, basically campaigning for votes. And then we determine the winner by counting up the cubes based on the election procedures. I'm going to cover all 4 procedures, but let's first cover some things that are common to all elections. First, the presidential nominees are always going to be the party leaders. So whoever the current party leader is, remember, that's based on popularity on the card plus popularity cubes for that statesman. And if there's a tie, the older statesman is considered more popular. That's what dictates who the party leaders are at any one time. A couple statesmen that are not eligible, any twice elected president, and so we use these to indicate that, for example, George Washington was elected once. If he won re-election and got a second white pawn, he would be a twice elected president and he would not be eligible. Other statesmen that are not eligible, based on the expansion, are any statesmen that have run for presidency and lost the presidency twice. So each time you run for president and you lose that, the candidate could potentially get a black ring. So if they run for president twice and lose twice, they'd have 2 black rings. Now you can remove those. So for example, let's say you are the current party leader and you already had 1 black ring. You could decline to run for president to remove that black ring. And then the next eligible statesman would be forced to run for president. And then obviously if you win the presidency, you'd get to remove your black ring. Also keep in mind, if you have 2 black rings, you can't run for president or vice president. After we identify the presidential nominees, they will announce their running mates. And the announcement order is always based on whoever party has less public support. And if that's tied, then whichever presidential candidate is less popular. And then if that's tied, whichever candidate is younger. There's a disadvantage to announcing first. So it's based on less public support, less popularity, or less experience, or the younger candidate. Also, the vice presidential nominee has to be from the same political party, and it can even be controlled by the same player. So if you're the presidential nominee, you can nominate a statesman of your own faction to be the vice president. It can't be the sitting president or anybody else currently running for president, and that'll take place in one-party elections. Statesmen cannot be forced to accept a vice presidential nomination unless they're the last eligible. So those are the VP rules that apply to all elections. Once we identify the presidential nominees, they announce their running mates, then they campaign and place cubes on the map. A couple of rules that apply to all elections. Each candidate will use a unique set of cubes. So the Conservative Party president and VP, and the Liberal Party president and VP. You can never have 2 cubes of the same color on a state. So once one color has been placed in a state, that's the only one that can be placed there. In terms of placement rules, the president's first placement must be their home state or as close as possible. So if George Washington is trying to place here in his home state of Virginia, I mean, that's where he has to place. If, for example, maybe the other party went and locked up that state, he would have to place as close as possible to that state. The vice presidential first placement also has to be in their home state. If they're unable to place in their home state, they have to place in a state adjacent to the president. And if they can't do that, they've got to place in an unattached state. All these states are attached, but later in the game, a state like California could come into play that's not attached to these. So the VP also has to place in their home state, otherwise in a state adjacent to the president, otherwise an unattached state. All subsequent cube placements have to be adjacent to a cube you already have. So George Washington, or in this case, the Conservative Party presidential candidate, can only place here, here, or here. It has to be adjacent to a state that they've already placed in. If they're unable to place in an adjacent state, they have to place in an unattached state. Otherwise, they would have to pass. But if you do have a legal placement, you do have to place your cube there. Also, for the first placement only on the map, the party that has the right to place first can opt to place second and force the other party to place first, but for the first placement only. And then you'll basically take turns placing until every candidate can no longer place a cube and all the states have been filled up potentially. The number of vacancies per state and the order of placement, that will vary based on the type of election that you're running. Once all the cubes are placed, then we count up the votes based on 12th Amendment passing or not passing, whether the cubes will count for the individual candidate or the ticket. That'll based on the election procedure. And then finding the winner will also vary based on the election procedure. So let's cover those in detail now. One last thing before we do that, the votes awarded by the state are based on the current era that we're in. So in era A, Georgia awards 4 electoral votes, and you can see they grow over time. So in the third era, they're awarding 13 votes in era C. And this is based on the last issue card played. So in the previous issue round, if the A deck was depleted and we revealed one B card, then we're always using the B deck. So it's always the era of the latest issue card ever drawn. All right, so let's first cover a two-party election, since that will be the most common election type. So the first thing we do is identify the nominees for each party. So that will be the party leaders. So let's say in this example, it's George Washington. So let's mark him, and he'll be the presidential candidate. And Thomas Jefferson is the current Liberal Party leader. He will be the Liberal Party presidential candidate. So now the candidates have to announce their running mate. The party with the least public support would have to announce first. Since it's tie, we look at whatever candidate's more popular. So since George Washington's more popular, 7 plus 3 is 10. To Thomas Jefferson's base 5, he's got no additional popularity cubes. He has to announce his running mate first. So let's say he announces Aaron Burr as his running mate. So let's mark him as the vice presidential candidate. And then George Washington, based on the setup, may decide, you know what, I'm going to select William Henry Harrison as my vice presidential candidate. One thing you'll remember is that the vice VP candidate has to place in their home state. So if Ohio's in the Union, he'll have to place in Ohio first. If Ohio's not in the Union, we'll use Virginia as William Henry Harrison's starting state. That's just a special exception for him. And the exception also applies for Andrew Jackson. If Tennessee isn't in the Union and he can't place in Tennessee, he uses the Carolinas as his home state. So in a two-party system, we identify the current party leaders as the presidential candidates, and they would announce their running mates. And now here's where we see some differences if the 12th Amendment has been passed or not passed. If the 12th Amendment has not been passed, then there will be 2 vacancies per state. If it has been passed, there will only be 1 vacancy per state for a cube. So let's cover the first example first. Let's say we're pre-12th Amendment, so there's 2 vacancies per state. The placement order, and this will apply either way, the placement order is the party with the most public support gets to place first. So the president will place their cube, and then the VP will place their cube. And then the other party, the president gets to place, and the VP gets to place. If public support is tied, like it is in this case, then we look at the presidential's candidate's popularity. And the one who has more gets to place first. And then likewise, if that's still tied, the one who's older gets to place first. So we know in our example, George Washington is more popular, so they get to place first. He must place in his home state of Virginia. Now his VP candidate gets to place first. William Henry Harrison. Ohio is not available, so we treat Virginia as his home state, and that's just his special exception. And now that the first party is placed, the other party gets to place. So Thomas Jefferson gets to place. Well, Virginia is now locked up. There are only 2 vacancies. So you'll remember from our rules, he'll have to place in the closest available state. So he can go here, here, or here. He'll decide to place there. And now his VP, Aaron Burr, is from New York, so he'll have to place in his home state of New York. So this will keep cycling through until all the states have been claimed. So let's just finish this example. So now we go back to George Washington. He can place here, here, or here. All subsequent placements have to be adjacent to where he already is. So he'll go up there. Now his VP candidate can no longer come up here. The state is now locked because there's only 2 vacancies. So they've basically, in essence, locked out the Liberal Party from moving down in the South. So he'll place there. Thomas Jefferson will place here. And Aaron Burr, he knows he can always get to here because that's the only way you can get to that state. So he'll come down here, basically blocking any of the conservative candidates from moving up through this state. This state's now blocked. So let's go back to George Washington. He only has one option if he wants to keep going north. He knows he can go south. He'll always have that open to him because there's 2 vacancies per state. You can never have 2 colors. Red can never take both spots. So he'll decide to go there. His VP candidate will come down here. Now Thomas Jefferson decides he's got a couple options. He can move into here, or he can move into here. I think he wants to block off New Jersey, so he'll come here, knowing that Aaron Burr will probably come there also, which he does, to block that off from George Washington getting in. So now it's George Washington's next turn, or the Conservative Party. So now he can't place adjacent to this spot, so now he just has to start moving into the south there. So he'll place there. His vice presidential candidate will place there. That's actually his only legal spot right now. Now we go back to the Liberals. Thomas Jefferson will place there to prevent Aaron Burr from getting there. And then Aaron Burr's only legal placement will be to finally go into New England. We go back to the Conservative Party. George Washington will place here. His VP has no legal placement, so he has to pass. Thomas Jefferson, though, can move up north here, so he'll do that. Aaron Burr has no legal placement, so he has to pass. Go back to the other party. George Washington goes there. We know the VP has to pass, and now Thomas Jefferson can come here. And that fills all the vacancies in all the states in this example. Okay, now we're ready to tally the votes. We're in Era A, so I've gone ahead and counted up all the votes here. Thomas Jefferson actually came out on top with the most votes. Aaron Burr had the second most votes. George Washington the third, and his running mate William Henry Harrison had the fourth. Now, it does not matter before the 12th Amendment is passed your presidential party or the nomination. So, for example, let's just say Aaron Burr had the most votes. Even though he was the VP, if he had the most votes, he becomes the president. Whoever gets the first highest votes becomes the president, and whoever gets the second highest votes becomes the VP. So you could have a VP candidate become president, and then maybe the presidential candidate from the other party would become the vice president. So you could have a president and vice president from different parties. So the party and the nomination does not matter. But in this example, Thomas Jefferson would become the president, and the second most votes, Aaron Burr, would become vice president. George Washington, as a defeated sitting president, would be retired from the game. And we'd count up his victory points. The green player would get 3 victory points, and then George Washington would get retired from the game. Normally, a defeated presidential candidate would just get a black ring, but since he was the sitting president, he actually gets retired, and now Thomas Jefferson is the elected president. But we'll cover all these end of election procedures at the end here. But that's basically how a two-party election would work prior to the passing of the 12th Amendment. 2 vacancies per state. The placement orders the party with most public support, then the other party, and then the cubes count for the candidate. The nomination or the party does not matter. The highest number of votes becomes the president. The second highest becomes the VP. If the election was indecisive, if there was a tie for president, there's a set of tiebreaker rules that we'll cover at the end. So what if it was a two-party election but the 12th Amendment had been passed? The only changes are there's now only 1 vacancy per state. So when George Washington came and placed his cube there, William Henry Harrison, as his VP, can't place there anymore. That's occupied. So he's got to place as close as possible to the president. So he may decide to come up here to block some stuff up there, or probably not, because that would block the president. But you can see there's only 1 vacancy per state. The other important thing is that now the cubes, actually, you know what, he would do that, because, here's why, the cubes count towards the ticket. So whether it's the orange or the red, all the votes get counted towards the presidential ticket. So, and then they get elected as a team. So it doesn't matter if there's more red cubes on the board. All red cubes are going to count towards the ticket. And if George Washington and William Henry Harrison won, George Washington would be president with William Henry Harrison as vice president. And who knows, if we completed this, it may work out the same, where Thomas Jefferson and Aaron Burr become president and vice president. But you can see the big difference is 1 vacancy, and the cube, the combined count, counts towards the ticket. So selecting your VP is very important in terms of state placement and trying to figure out how are you going to campaign from your home state to capture the most election votes possible. But prior to the 12th Amendment, sometimes that doesn't work, and the VP ends up getting more votes and becoming president, like it did in real life. Keep in mind there are action cards that can affect the vote too, and these can be played at any time. So there are several states where you can actually divide the vote. So in this example, during an election, when another player's cube is in Maryland and yours isn't, you get to place your cube there below their cube. And then you and that candidate get to split the vote evenly. So let's say, and you don't need adjacency for that. So let's say George Washington wasn't in Maryland, and it was prior to the 12th election. Let's just say this was the case. Probably couldn't happen that way, but he could play that card and say, you know what, I'm going to split votes with Thomas Jefferson there. And then the blue would get split. They'd each get 5, whereas the purple would get all 10. If it was after the 12th Amendment, there'd only be 1 vacancy, so he could come in there and say, you know what, I'm going to split my votes with that candidate. So there's ways that the cards can interact with the election too. All right, now let's cover how a single party or a one-party election might work. So let's say the Conservative Party got political support into the dominance range of 9 or higher. We now follow the one-party election rules. So the presidential nominee is always the current party leader. So George Washington would have to be, in this example, our presidential nominee. Now we also have the option of the next three in line can run for presidency if they like. So you'd go to the next most eligible. So who's the next most popular? Maybe it's, well, there's Hamilton with 4. John Adams is 4, and we know he's older, so he'd be the next one that's given the option to run. So he can say, yes, I choose to run, or no, I choose not to run. But basically, you go down the line, and the next 3 in line have the option of running for president. So you can have 4 candidates total. So it's always the current leader and the next 3 in line have the option of running. So you can have 4 total candidates from the same party in a one-party election. The running mates phase would work mainly the same. They would have to, since they're from the same party, they're going to share the same public support. So the least popular would have to announce their running mate first, and if there's a tie, obviously the youngest would have to announce first. Member statesmen are not forced to accept unless they're last eligible. Now here's a special rule for a single party election. If multiple nominees can be the same running mate, so maybe George Washington and John Adams both ask John Jay to be their vice president. He can accept both of them. But if he accepts one, he has to accept all. He can't accept one and decline another. He can decline all of them or accept all of them. And as usual, you can't nominate the sitting president or someone already running for president to be your VP. So now here's the way cube placement would work in a one-party election. If it's before the 12th Amendment, there would be 2 vacancies per state, and the placement order would be all the candidates would be placing individually. So in theory, you could have up to 4 people running for president from the same party, and all 4 of them could have nominated different vice presidents, so you could have 8 people involved in this election. So you'd have to just get different cubes to mark each of their colors. The placement order would be based on their popularity. So the most popular would go first. So it doesn't matter the president-VP combo. Whoever's most popular, even if it's one of the VP, well, it would never be that because they would be the candidate. But whoever's the most popular places first, and then whoever's the next most popular. That may be someone running for VP versus president. So you go in popularity order and place cubes, 2 vacancies per state using the normal placement rules. And then as normal, if there's a tie for popularity, whoever's older gets the place first. The president or VP nomination doesn't matter. And just like in the 2-party system, all the cubes will count individually for those candidates. So the nomination doesn't matter. If someone who was nominated for VP garnered the most amount of votes, they could potentially become president. The difference here, though, is that in addition to getting the most amount of votes, you have to capture a majority. So you have to get more than 50% of the votes. So if we're in Era A, we'd add up all the Era A votes from all the states and figure out what a majority would equal, and then that candidate would have to get past that threshold. So if they capture the majority of the state's votes, they're awarded the presidency. The second highest gets VP. If it's indecisive, if a candidate is unable to get that 50% majority, then we'd go to the tiebreaker rules, which we'll cover later. If the 12th Amendment has been passed, it works slightly different. So there are still 2 vacancies per state, but they're designated for the presidential candidates and the vice presidential candidates. So to make it clear, the left side of the state card will be for a presidential candidate placement, and the right side of the card will be for a VP presidential candidate placement. So you can only ever have 2 cubes, but the left side for the president placement and the right side for the vice president placement. The placement order still happens the same way. You go down in popularity order, but if I'm a presidential candidate, I can only fill the vacancy on the left side, and likewise, if I'm a VP candidate, I can only fill the vacancy on the right side. The cubes count for the presidential and vice presidential candidates respectively. So you'll add up all the left sides of the card, and those will be the votes for the presidency. And again, you have to capture the majority, so you have to get above 50% to win the presidency. And the right side of the card will be for the vice president. So that's why you can have a candidate running for running on multiple tickets, because you'd add up the right side, and they have to capture 50% of the vote also to become the vice presidential winner. Okay, so in a single party election, it's a lot more common that the result's going to be indecisive if a president or a VP cannot capture that majority. So you go to the tiebreaker rules. Basically, it's going to come down to the states. So any fourth or higher placement ties are not considered. So first of all, rule them out. So if you have two candidates tied for first and two candidates tied for second, so you've got still two placements, so all four candidates could be eligible to run. Any fourth and beyond are thrown out. Basically, what will happen is each state in the union, or each state card in the union, is pulled separately. The state order will be decided by the current president. So they may decide, we're going to pull Virginia first. And then in normal voting order, like the congressional voting, we start with the player of the left of the current president. Each player's statesman from that state can cast or buy all their congressional votes for any nominee involved. So for example, we'd go to the first player, and if they have any statesman from Virginia, we'd look at, the votes they have on their card, and all those votes are cast for any of the eligible people in the tiebreaker. And as usual, they can spend influence cubes to cast 3 additional votes in that process. So we'd keep going around the table. We'd go to the next player. Maybe they didn't have any Virginia statesmen, so they wouldn't get to cast any votes. And the next player, if they had some Virginia statesmen, they'd cast all their votes for one of the eligible nominees, and then we'd have all the votes cast for the state of Virginia. Now, the nominee that receives the most vote wins the state. So they get one state in their column in this election. If it's tied, the state simply does not count. The nominee with the most states, after all the states have been pulled, the nominee with the most states, not votes, wins the office. If it's still tied, if they have the same number of states, the Chief Justice will decide. If there is no Chief Justice, you simply go to the candidate with the most popularity, otherwise the oldest. The nominee with the second most states in this process becomes the vice president, unless they were running as a ticket in a two-party system, or the tiebreaker was simply for VP only. Finally, at the end of every election, any president that had been twice elected is retired, and we'd score their popularity cubes and add that to their victory point score, or any defeated presidents. So a sitting president would get retired from the game. Now, there could be a situation where the sitting president had enough votes to become VP. In either case, they are still retired, and the VP office would just sit vacant. So a sitting president, if defeated, always retires, as well as twice elected presidents. They would have retired, a prior twice elected president. You award the new office cards. So the office of the vice presidency and the presidency now get awarded to the new statesman. They get popularity cubes for the office, even if they were reelected. So let's say George Washington won re-election, he would still get the 3 popularity cubes. And John Adams, in this case, it wasn't John Adams, right? He selected William Henry Harrison in our one example. William Henry Harrison would get the vice presidency and the 1 popularity cube that goes with it. Also remember to assign an elected presidential figure. So if Washington won re-election, he'd get a second one. So he wouldn't be eligible in the next election. He'd be forced to retire. Also, anybody who was running for president that didn't win, make sure to give them a black ring to mark that they had a failed bid for the presidency. And those are the 4 sets of procedures for the different election types in the game. A couple final points before we close out the election phase. Any presidents, twice elected presidents that get retired, or if a sitting president gets defeated and gets retired, you follow the same procedure as if they died. So you'd score their popularity cubes, you'd reduce this faction's vote in Congress. Obviously, there'd be a new party leader. So follow the same normal procedure as if the statesman had died. Also, to accept the new office of president or vice president, you'll have to resign any prior offices, typically the offices that persist from turn to turn, like the general or the chief justice. You would have to obviously resign that office before accepting the new one. And finally, since I'm playing with the expansion, there's a rule for a high tension election. At the start of the election phase, if the tension is 1 before we reach civil war, we follow a special procedure and a special set of rules for a high tension election. And it's in the Offices and Statesmen rulebook. All right, let's cover the last phase of the term, and that's the people phase. This is conducted by all players. So the first thing that happens is each player receives 1 influence point, and each party leader receives 1 influence point on the card. Also, some statesmen will receive influence points as indicated on their card. So every player would get a influence cube in their supply. Then we would provide influence cubes on the card of the current party leaders. And we're just going to use this generic setup where Washington was still the party leader along with Thomas Jefferson. So they both got 1. And then make sure to check the powers on the cards. So for example, Alexander Hamilton receives 1 influence per turn. And so this is when they would get that cube on their card. Another thing to keep in mind is check the cards for other abilities. Some statesmen in the expansion now have an extra ability when they act as general. So normally, for example, Andrew Jackson's ability is 2, but when he's the general, his ability is 3. William Henry Harrison also has the ability, so when acting as a general, his ability gets to go from 1 to 2. Always remember that any influence points on a statesman card can never be moved. They can only be used in solving the issues or on the 3 activities that actually take place during the people phase. Make a speech, whip up support, and fund newspapers. So we'll cover those. But before we get to that, after we give out the influence points, then we're going to draft action cards. So we always deal 7 cards. We'll just draw them from the top of the action deck. And then each player will get to draft 1 card. And we'll actually do it in a specific order. This is a catch-up mechanic. So the first player to draw will be the player who's in last place. Basically, the fewest VPs plus popularity cubes. Remember, popularity cubes will eventually become VPs. So basically, you're checking your status on the track along with potential VPs that'll eventually come. And then the player with the fewest would draw first, and the player with the most would draw last. Again, if you're tied, you go to the fewest votes in Congress, and if still tied, the oldest statesman. So I like to use the extra action discs that came, and then you can actually set the draft order based on fewest VPs, if tied, fewest votes, if tied, whoever has the oldest statesman, and set the draft order. Keep in mind a player's hand limit is 3 cards. So a player can only hold 3 action cards at any one time. So if a player ever holds more than 3, they have to immediately play or discard a card. Now keep in mind, you can play action cards whenever you like. The only restrictions are if there's a restriction on the card, but also when playing a statesman, that player's state has to be in play in order to play the card. So you may have 4 cards, and maybe you have a statesman whose state is not in play. You may decide to actually discard that card. All discards, all actually played and discarded action cards go into the same stack. I usually just put those face up at the bottom of the action deck. And then if the action deck ever gets depleted, you'll take all played and discarded action cards, unless it says to remove the card from the game. Otherwise, you'll take all played and discarded action cards, shuffle them with the next deck, the Era 2 deck in this case, and then create your new action deck ready for play. The next thing that happens after drafting action cards is we control newspapers. So the party leaders for each party get to adjust the newspaper track for their parties. The president's party gets to go first. Now, if this was the first turn of the game, there wouldn't be any cubes here yet, but I put a couple cubes here as an example. So the party leaders, let's say the Conservative Party is still in the presidency, they have the choice of moving cubes on the bottom. They can be moved to the upper track, and then once the cubes are moved up, you can apply the results on the cubes on the upper track and then move them leftwards. So for example, the Conservative Party party leader would have the option of deciding to move this up. Now, why they might wait is in the next round, when we get to funding the newspapers, statesmen can pay to move them on the track. So the further you get it moved, the more points or more public support you eventually get to cash in. But let's say the conservative leader does decide to move this up. Once those decisions are made, then we apply these and move the cubes to the left. So the Conservative Party would receive 1 public support, and this would get returned to the pool. And the Liberal Party would get 2 public support, and this would slide here. So you can see on a previous turn, this moved. Someone moved this all the way here. It moved up. They got 3, then 2, then 1. So by moving it here, you get a chance to cash them in. So during the control newspapers, party leaders can decide to move them up, and then you apply the results on the top and move them to the left. One thing I wanted to point out is the Postmaster General's party. You can see if this becomes a cabinet position when Amos Kendall enters play, then the Postmaster General controls his party's newspapers instead of the party leader. After controlling the newspapers, we go to the round phase, and this whole extra player aid covers the 3 main actions that can happen in the round phase. This is conducted clockwise by all players. The president goes first. Each player may do all 3 of the actions, but only once. They can make a speech and or whip up support and or fund the newspapers. So let's take a look at each of those actions. Alright, so the first action that you can do is make a speech. It'll cost 1 influence point, so the player spends 1 influence point, designates one of their statesmen, and then rolls a die. After the roll, they can spend additional influence or green cubes to increase the die roll because they need a 6 in order to receive a popularity. So they may spend 1 influence, roll a 4, for example, and then decide, yes, I will spend 2 additional influence to make that a 6, so I can get a popularity cube on that statesman. I wanted to point out in the expansion, some of the statesmen have the new orator ability. So you can see Patrick Henry, for example, he can make a speech for 0 IP. So normally it would cost 1 IP to make a speech. He can do it for free during this round. And he can always add 1 to the die roll. So do it for free. If he rolls a 5, then he automatically gets a 6, and he would succeed. But that would count as the 1 speech for that player. The next thing you can do is you can whip up support. Basically, you get to move public support in the direction of one statesman. So basically just name the statesman, it'll cost 1 influence point, and then you get to roll the dice to determine the amount of movement. If it's a 1 or a 2, unfortunately no movement, you get to move 1 space in the direction of that statesman's party on a 3 or a 5, and if you roll 6, you get to move 2 spaces. And the last action you can do is to fund the newspapers. This is how cubes get on the newspaper's track. So you choose a statesman, and then you can do one of 2 things. You could spend 1 influence point to place a cube of his party on the start position, or you can spend 2 influence points to move right 1 space a cube of their party. So if you wanted to, you can see 1 IP to place a cube there, or if a cube was already there, you could spend 2 to move it here. Or if a cube was there, you could spend 2 to move it there. And as a reminder, each player can do all 3 of these actions, but they can only do them once on their turn. So remember, we start with the president, so the president will take up to all 3 of these actions once, and then moving clockwise, the next player will execute, and then around the table. And then the final part of the people phase is an extra auction, or an auction for extra initiative. So we start at the player's left, doing an auction. Each player may bid any of his IPs, so the influence points or the green cubes, for extra initiative. Or they can pass. So they can pass, or the minimum bid is 1. And then going clockwise, a player obviously would have to exceed that bid. And then the winner of the auction is just once around. You can keep going around until every player has passed, and the winner draws an additional action card from the top and performs 1 additional of the 3 actions. Make a speech, whip up support, and fund newspapers. And that's optional. All right, correction. I was right the first time. So the bidding is only a once around. So starting at the president's left, that player can pass or bid 1, and then each subsequent bid has to be higher than the last one, and you only get 1 chance. Each bid must exceed the last one, and then the bidding goes around only once. The winner of the extra initiative pays the IPs, pays the green cubes. Everybody else's bids gets returned to them, and then they get to do the action of drawing an action card, and then may perform one of the 3 actions. If nobody bids, if everybody passes, there is no extra initiative that round. A couple clarifying points about the people's phase. If the player's drawing an action card as part of the extra initiative, and it's a dead card, maybe it's impossible to come into play, they can draw an immediate replacement. Also, you'll remember we talked about the stateswomen cards. So if one of those cards gets drawn and somebody has already played the spouse card, that card automatically gets given to the player that played the spouse card, and they get to add that statesman. And in that case, you would draw a replacement card also. One other thing I wanted to point out, most actions can be played at any time. Here's a specific action that says play during own turn only. So that would be during the player's turn when they're making the decisions to do one of these actions. That's when a dual card can be played. The other example of potentially dead cards I was referring to, Hamlin, for example, if that statesman gets drawn, but because of other issues, it's impossible for that state to come into the Union, then that statesman, in effect, is dead. They can never be played. So you can discard, remove that from the game, and immediately draw a replacement. So that's an example. Here's a couple other action cards that have come up in the FAQ. So the theory of nullification, the Hartford Convention, and secession has prerequisites. So the prerequisites here, the prerequisites only are required to play the first option. So if you can meet this, you can play this. Otherwise, you can always play the second option on these cards. So the prerequisites only required if you want to play the first option on these cards. Here's another one, make important speech. You indicate a statesman who has at least 3 popularity. This can be popularity on the card. This doesn't necessarily mean 3 popularity cubes. So if their base popularity, for example, John Adams is 4, this card could have been played at any time during any of the rounds of the game. Some other cards like Dominate the President or Expose a Spy in the Cabinet, these can be played on a statesman within your own party or within your own faction. Another point about these cards is, remember, cards can be played at any time, so they can possibly interrupt a deal that was made. So maybe the president made a deal with another player. Hey, if I appoint you this office, then can you handle this issue and, give me the support I need? Remember, those are separate steps. So even though they've agreed in concept to this elaborate deal, the president then appoints the office. Technically, before they hand over the issue to that office, one of these cards could be played that interrupts that and then possibly steals offices away from another player. One thing I didn't mention when I was talking about death, if we see the Hand of Time icon, if at any time a player has no statesman in play and they have no playable statesman in their hand, what they do is they show their hand to say, hey, I don't have any statesman I can play and I have none on the board. They get to receive a statesman from another player. So basically, if the player loses his last statesman, maybe it got stolen away as one of the female statesmen, or he died in death, and again, not holding any, reveals his hand to the other players and names another player who is or is tied for the most statesmen. So as long as the other player is at least tied for the most statesmen, that player decides which of his statesmen to give the player that doesn't have any. And as usual, you would update, obviously, the votes in Congress, any influence points or popularity, or maybe it's even negative popularity with the statesman that's being transferred. That all comes with that statesman. And also keep in mind, when a statesman dies or is retired, you score these VPs, the popularity cubes, but any other influence points are lost on that statesman. One other interesting action or statesman card that can come up is Elbridge Gerry from Massachusetts. You can see he has a different colored background. It's kind of a white background. He's considered to belong to both parties or to either party. So he can never be a party leader, even if he's president. If he ever runs for president, he can only run for president in the event of single-party dominance. He always has to announce his running mate first. And when you're resolving elections, he always has to place his markers last, unless public support is 0, in which case he gets to place first, I guess because he's an independent. If he's the president, he doesn't observe party alignment in appointing offices, so he doesn't have to worry about that. In the event of an economic crisis, public support only moves towards the middle or towards 0. And the order of the control of the newspapers is conducted first by the party with the most public support, then the party leader with most popularity, then the oldest, like we talked about. Here's another one that doesn't come up until Generation 3, John Fremont from California. I just wanted to point him out because you'll remember during the elections, you've got to place on your home state first. So he can place on California, but that'll be a detached state for the most part. And so with his next placement, he can place on any state in any other region, and from there he has to spread his cubes. Alright, so those are just some of the most common things that come up. Let's talk about how the game can end. So the game can end in one of several ways. If the tension reaches the Civil War, again the game ends. As we talked about, if we end in an economic crisis and a monetary collapse, the game can end. If both parties cannot field the required presidential and VP nominees to conduct an election, the game will also end. If only one party can't do it, then we would just treat that as single party dominance. But if neither party can get the requisite number of candidates, that's also a trigger for the end game. And then finally, the game will end on the turn where the last issue card is drawn. You'll finish out the president's term, dealing with the 4 issues. You'll have one final election, and then the game will end. At the end of the game, all players will score any remaining popularity cubes and add those to their VP track. And if the game ended by resolving the last issue without going to Civil War, then the winner is the player that has the most VPs. If the game ended because of crisis, the players could not hold an election, or we had a monetary collapse, or we actually had a civil war, players will get deducted VPs. They will lose VPs based on their votes in Congress. So they had lots of power in Congress, but it wasn't used effectively because the country was doomed in the end. So they'll deduct VPs for their current number of votes in Congress. They'll also deduct VPs for each influence point or influence cube left in their faction. Basically, this was influence that went unused in the effort of saving the country. So deduct those from the current victory points, and the player with the most victory points wins the game. There are several other variants and optional configurations and scenarios that you can set up where it doesn't start from the beginning. So consult the rulebook and pick the options that work best for you. But that should be everything you need to set up and play Founding Fathers.